G'day all. I'm going to do a video around my story. I think this is going to end up being a series of videos. So I'll turn it into something kind of episodic. But I wanted to respond to some emails I had received, but also the recent poll I put out when I took a couple of weeks off to spend some quality time with the kids. And I want to just probably premise with a couple of things before I get into my story. Firstly, you can probably tell already this is a very raw and unscripted video. And I'm going to do that quite deliberately for a number of reasons. I script out my Blueprint of Family Violence videos quite deliberately because I think you need to be precise with those. This is my story. I also need to be precise. I also need to be accurate. But I want you to also come across the raw feeling that goes with a lot of that stuff, which you lose a little bit when you do a script. Sometimes you'll hear my feelings bleed through a little bit occasionally in the scripts. But here I'm going to follow a series of bullet points that I put together. But I'm going to tell my story in a very raw way. I also want to start off by saying a couple other things. One is I want to thank everybody who has contributed their thoughts and comments in the videos. I've had people who have reached out and emailed me separately to thank me for the content that I am producing and recognizing how challenging and difficult it is as a topic. And for somebody who has both been through family violence as a male victim, but also has been trained in the topic. So I'm a certified coach, but helping others through that. It's such a challenging topic. It's so frequently misunderstood and dismissed, which you'll hear in my story as well when I get to kind of that point in my story. And it is one of those ones where I find it surprising that the voice of male victims is not readily there nor readily heard. So I want to thank everybody who has shown their support for this channel, has reached out to me personally and thanked me for putting this material together. It really means a lot. A couple housekeeping things before I get into my story. One minor logistics thing, I'm going to turn off the automatic subtitling for the software system I use, predominantly because it is so slow. It really gummies up the works because I have to manually go in and correct it, whether it's my accent or something else, I don't know. But also, I'm going to say this up front, the content I'm going to step through is about abuse, if that's not obvious on the fact that I'm talking about my story. And I'll talk about um, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. I'll talk about challenging topics like suicide, and the impact on children. So if this video is confronting to you, or if it triggers something in you, please pause, please stop. You don't need to go through this video if it's too hard for you. And again, it might be a series of videos. I'll find out as I go. So don't pressure yourself to push through if you don't need to. If you need someone to talk to, you can reach out to me through my website. The details are in my bio. And if you do need some support beyond that, reach out to your local support centers that you have. For those of you who are new here, this is Stand Again. It's a lived experience platform built specifically for male victims of family violence. And I think by the time you get to the end of my story, you'll understand really deeply about why I created Stand Again. And if you read the the subtitles, or not the subtitles, The titles of the chapters that I'm going to go through in my story on the left hand side, you'll see, in part why I created Stand Again. I know that abuse is not limited to one gender. That is quite a bit of the feedback that I tend to get, which is this is not gender biased. I do recognize that the topics I step through are not limited to one gender, but there are a lot of things that I do talk about that are very specific to the male perspective, and my channel and my story are obviously from the male perspective. But also, more deeply than that, the male story of family violence is so often ignored. It's so often dismissed by brushing it through some myths around men. And the understanding of male specific victims of family violence, that's not there. It doesn't exist. Like, you can come across terms like maternal superiority complex, but it's done in such a way that it's kind of brushed through and it's hard to find. Like, if you don't know what you're looking for, it's actually kind of hard to find. So that's why Standing Again is something that I built, but I'll get into that when I get into my story. If this content is resonates with you, if it helps you in any particular way, or if you just want to show your support for the channel, then please like, comment, and subscribe. All of that helps the algorithm push this content out to people who may or may not need it. And your engagement does help other men and other victims of family violence realize that they're not alone. So it's already 7 minutes in. I've been prattling. It's literally just the introduction. And hopefully, just by that alone, you can start to see why I script out my content so much just to stop me from prattling on. So I'm going to get into my story. Take your time with it. Stop it if it's too much. But off we go. So let's start at the beginning, yeah, which is the fairy tale. It's the first time I met my ex-wife. I genuinely thought this was my soulmate. She was amazing. Like, she was so engaging. She fully believed everything that I fully believed. She was extremely charming. She was so sweet. She was so kind. She was so soft. Our first date went for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And, we kind of went from the date venue to a pub venue. And then, they locked up shop and we were still there. And, they had to kick us out, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I had never met anybody who mirrored me and loved me so much in the first few moments of having met. Um, in the first few months, I would hear things from her like, "I can't believe how closely aligned that we are, and you're everything I have ever wanted in a man, and we're going to build such a beautiful future together, and our life is going to be incredible together. And I've always been waiting for somebody just like you." And she mirrored everything that I believed in. Like, and if I talked about travel, for example, they were all her lifelong dreams as well. If I talked about my values or my family values, she would agree instantly. Like, oh, that's exactly how I see life as well. And it was like finally meeting your person. Like, this was the person who I thought the universe had brought us together. And obviously, in hindsight, you kind of go back and go, oh, it's love bombing and that's mirroring. And, she showered me with gifts and she did things for me that I had like, I'd never had someone, get me gifts before, that kind of stuff. And it was just amazing at the beginning. And I was smitten. And in the first few weeks, we were talking, life and love and marriage and children and where we'd live and what we would do and our kind of these one day dream things that we would talk about. And they weren't vague; they were specific, and they were all the things that I had ever dreamt of and wanted. It felt very much like everything just clicked right at the beginning. And again, you see this stuff in hindsight, but she moved into my apartment. I had this apartment just out of the city that she moved into like in the first couple of weeks of us dating. Like major red flag today, but at the time I thought it was part of destiny. And the reality was, I was doing fly in, fly out work. So I would very literally, get up at 5 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, sorry, on a Monday, hop onto an airplane, fly off to, at the time it was New South Wales, and I'd work from New South Wales through to Thursday night, fly back Thursday night, work from the office on Friday, and then spend the weekend getting ready for the week on. And I was doing that for God knows how long. And I was barely using the apartment. So when she came to me in the first few weeks, talking about how challenging her rent was, how her boss was toxic and a womanizer and sexist and well, sexual harassment from her boss and how everybody she works with hates her and how messy her roommate is and how the roommate is toxic and all that kind of stuff. For me at the time, I was well, to be frank, like also the sex was great. The sex was just absolutely off the charts in those first few weeks. And being a dumb, young, hopeless bloke who saw this damsel in distress, I gave her a key to the apartment because I was barely using it anyway, and it meant what I thought was what I meant was there'd be sex and there'd be romance and this is love and this is the full storybook and this is everything I had ever dreamed of. I was just intoxicated by this individual. And all the kind of comments around her boss and she has to quit because of the sexual harassment, so she's going to be out of a job like that. All just was like, oh, I'll help. So at this point, we're kind of a month or two into a relationship, and by this point, I had already established myself as the primary provider. She was struggling at work. I was already paying the rent of my apartment, so it didn't make sense that suddenly I don't pay half the rent. I was already filling it up with food and paying all the utilities and all that kind of stuff. And because she had to leave her toxic manager and because everybody at work hated her, she was unstable. She didn't have a job, so I took on that role of providing for everything: the rent, the food, the bills, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that kind of set the premise for the rest of the relationship. But I'll contribute once I had things stabilize on my end. And in those first like few months, it was just amazing. Like she was taking me around to her friends to show her off. And I remember actually the very, very, very first time. This is now we're getting into the turn, yeah, where you're starting to see red flags. The very first time I remember seeing her with a friend of hers, who was a artist. She was a performer, and I remember distinctly, like this is the first time I had ever been with my girlfriend at the time, where I had a third party, her friend, there, and the personality change just blew my socks off. Like, gone was the kind, the soft, the sweet person that I had known in those that month, and gone was the respectful person. And now here I was, sitting across the table from a loud, obnoxious, rude woman who was making fun of me in front of her friend and was being drinking and getting obnoxious and getting rude. And I was sitting there. And this is, I'll talk a lot about in this series of videos. I'll talk a lot about the kind of moving of the line that should not be crossed. But for me, I was young and I was dumb, and I was like, "Oh, her friend is a bad influence." Not she's got a different mask on and she's behaving differently. Instead, I'm like, "Oh, her friend is a bad influence," and I grew to dislike her friend because I was like, "Look at the bad influence that her friend is to her," without recognizing that it was my soon to be ex-wife eventually who was just putting on a completely different mask for the situation that she was in. And so I very much um, would let these kind of little moments go and go, oh, that was just this, and oh, that was just that. And it took about um, 6 months, I think, for when things started to turn. And they would always be, it started off as these kind of slow, small fights, or these kind of comments that would just come out of left field, where you'd be like, "What the hell was that?" And it would be like, "Oh, you don't love me, or you don't care about me," and these little things, and you'd be going, "No, no, no, I do. What do you mean? Oh, how do I prove I love you?" And me being young and dumb and stupid. Oh, what do I do? What do I do? So it'd be a lot of that, and then. If we did have fights, like, I'd get accused of something, or I would say, "Hey, I kind of didn't like, the fact that I've kind of come home after 4 days of work interstate, and the place is a disaster zone, and I'm having to clean up, plus I'm having to get everything ready and washed, plus I've got to work, first thing in the morning, and it's already 10 o'clock at night by the time I've gotten home, all that kind of stuff." And then suddenly, by the end of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd be apologizing to her for having upset her, having been away for 4 days and then come home, and I've started the fight and all this stuff, which is a classic Darvo, by the way. And I'd find myself consoling her a lot. Like she'd start these fights, and before I realized what was going on, like she'd be screaming and yelling at me, and I'd be defending myself, and then she'd be this mess, bawling her eyes out, going, "I've ruined everything," and I'd be like, "No, no, no, you haven't ruined everything." And then I'd be in this role of trying to assure her that everything was okay and that we would work through this, and whatever I need to do, we'll kind of get our way back to the magic that we once had. Very classic. So for those of you who have been through this types of relationships before, it's a classic test. So it's a form of intermittent reinforcement as a part of trauma bonding. It's very, very fascinating to kind of go through. And if you are unskilled, like I was, young and dumb, you're easily susceptible to it. And those small fights, they would work. And for a while, it was like they recharged her battery. Yeah, like she would be fine. Seem lighter the next day. It was like none of it ever happened. And I started to get used to these kind of periodic fights because they didn't really happen that often. And when they did, like, I was starting to work out the formula, which is I would apologize and then the magic would come back. It would never be at the same level it was at the beginning. Like at the beginning of the relationship, it was, sex was off the chart, loving was off the chart, respect was off the chart. It would never be up to that level, but it'd always be kind of, fairly close. So the kind of distance between fights, or the frequency between fights, was, slow. And for those of you aware, you recognize that I'm talking about the slow ramp up to full on abuse. But then, a new fight would start again. It would be about a new topic, and it would be about, so and so mistreated me, and you didn't step in, and you didn't do this, and you didn't do that. And be like, hang on, sorry. So this person mistreated you, and I was one at fault. Like this is, and I'd have this argument with her, and then suddenly I'd be apologizing for having started this fight and being not understanding, so on and so forth. And then it would ramp up. Yeah, silent treatment. Things would get louder. The criticisms would get worse. The accusations would start to get crazier and crazier and crazier. And that was essentially, the kind of cycle that I had started to find myself in, constantly trying to claw us back to the kind of magic we had at the beginning. And bearing in mind, this entire time, I was still convinced that this was my soulmate. And I, thought this is, I'm not blameless here. I was a young, dumb idiot. I was a fucking muppet. And I would try to claw us back to, this person I thought was, my soulmate, back to that place that we used to be. And at the time, I was carrying some really deep wounds and some really, heavy insecurities and some um, real heavy myths that were culturally embedded. So I was carrying a wound. My father had passed, just before I had met my, what was eventually to be my wife, had just passed, and I was deeply mourning the loss of that man. Like it was a typical a British um, upper lip type bloke who was the kindest, most honourable human being I have ever met in my entire life. Like he was absolutely amazing man. Just fucking smart as, extremely lateral, extremely kind, loved his riddles, and like he would vanish. Like you'd be out with him, and he'd vanish, and you go, "Where the fuck did he go?" And you go, "It's okay. I can figure out where he is because I just need to stand still for a second and just listen for laughter." And then you'd hear laughter in the distance, and you'd go, "I'll follow the laughter." And he would have struck up a conversation with a complete and utter stranger, and they'd be laughing their heads off like they'd been mates for decades. Like that was the kind of bloke he was, and I loved him to death. So he passed before I met my um, girlfriend, who would become my wife, and I was sad, deeply, deeply hurt, deeply, deeply depressed because he was a person I respected and cherished above all. And also, I was carrying, aside from that grief, carrying a whole lot of immaturity. Yeah, like I did not grow up in a home full of conflict and trauma. Like my parents were had their issues, don't get me wrong, every family has their issues, but it wasn't that bad. So I didn't have the skill set for being in conflict. So when I found myself in fights, I have never been in arguments like this before, and suddenly I was screaming and yelling at the insanity because it'd be predominantly insanity I'd have to be dealing with, and I'd be like, "What the fuck are you on about?" Like, and that would be my response because I'd be like, "What the fuck? Like, I don't get it." So my skill set in responding was terrible. I would try to justify myself. I would argue the points. I would try to defend myself. I would try to explain myself, so on and so forth. I go into these modes. For those of you who don't know that, I just went through JADE, which is JADE, and I would be doing that in a terrible way because I just didn't have the skill set for being in this type of relationship before. And again, here I was with someone I thought was my soulmate. So I was trying so hard. So I try to fight for it because that's what I thought. But also, my father had taught me happy wife, happy life. And if for those of you who have seen my video around myths, you'll see that as one of the myths, happy wife, happy life. So in a healthy relationship, hell yeah. Making sure your partner is well serviced and making sure that she's happy, that's a part of a good, healthy relationship. And in an abusive relationship, that is not a good thing at all in any way, shape, or form because it's ripe for manipulation, control, one-sided, satisfaction, so on and so forth. Your happiness is not a part of that equation in an abusive relationship. In a healthy relationship, happy wife, happy life is actually really happy spouse, happy house. In an abusive relationship, I was right for it. So I would still lean into that. I would still go, well, a happy wife. So I've got to do more. I've got to be more. I've got to sacrifice more. I've got to allow more boundaries to go. And that became my norm. And again, this was someone I thought mirrored my values, mirrored my hobbies, mirrored my interests, and respected me. And I would push through constantly, trying to make us go back to where we were. So I didn't have the skill sets. I was young, I was immature, I was stupid, like, which is really, you know, I've got my university degrees. I studied at Harvard Business School. I've been through a whole lot of different things. I have had director roles, and I've had run organizations which are over 130 odd people, and I've designed companies and launched them and all that kind of stuff. But I was dumb. Like, compare when it came to relationships, I was young, dumb, and immature, and rife full of all of these cliches around what I thought relationships should be, that left me open to being within an abusive relationship. So we're getting close to half an hour. So what I might do is I'm going to wrap it up, but um, what I'm going to do is just leave it at this little point, um, just because I want to come back to uh, the hint. So here we are now in my story where the cycle of abuse was starting to ramp up. And again, I'm still talking within 6 months of the relationship here. And the cycle of it's called trauma bonding and intermittent reinforcement, that was starting to pick up. And again, I was stupid and I was dumb, and that's part of the reason why Stan again exists here, which is so other people aren't as stupid and dumb as I was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here for a minute and leave it at this kind of half hour mark. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk about a line not crossed. So, a line not crossed is after we moved out of the apartment, we moved into a house. And that's when the abuse started in earnest. So, I want to spend at least half an hour just stepping through what that looks like in the next episode. So, if you're interested in hearing this story, continue on. I know I've only really just talked about the first 6 months. I've only really just touched on love bombing in reality. Really just talked about the fact that I was carrying my own wounds, my own triggers. But in the next episode, I'll start walking through all the things that started to occur within an abusive relationship before we get to what I refer to as awakening moments. So if you've been with me for the journey so far, thank you very much. Please drop in some comments, even if it's just can't wait for the next episode, or sorry you've been through that, look forward to the next episode, or something similar, or even hey, don't like your raw rattles, go back to scripts, please. I'm all for it. Thank you very much. I'll chat to you soon. Bye. This is Stand Again, lived experience platform for male survivors of family violence. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice might just help another man find his. If you're looking for one on one support, you can book coaching with a member of the Stand Again team. Simply visit standagain.com.au, where you will also find grounded information on surviving and recovering from family violence as a man. As always, remember that no matter how many times you've been knocked down, you can stand again.